Well, thanks for joining me today to discuss all things business and technology.
Yeah,
It's
of course.
definitely a pleasure to have you on. So we'll get into some of the questions and so forth around the podcast. So
Yeah.
one of the first questions I always ask is like, what is your role and what's your company you're at today?
Yeah, so I'm the director of engineering for Hearst Autos, and they specifically fall under Hearst magazines.
And in that role itself, what's some of the biggest challenges that you faced that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, so there are three different web properties. So there's carandriver.com, AutoWeek, and roadandtrack.com. And there's also a SaaS platform underneath all of those that operate on what we would say the OEM sites, or you can imagine different client sites that they're actual manufacturers. Things like trade-in value applications, things like that. So there are the contents, all the different publishing stuff that goes on, the SaaS platform, and we also have a bunch of testing data for all the cars that are all done by the car and driver team. So there's a whole database for that and to integrate that across the different platforms, making sure everything's healthy and making sure everything is fast. Those are really the biggest challenges technically, and I'm sure the content teams, have their own challenges of making sure that all of this stuff is visible. But luckily, that's not our area.
Now, is this something that you, being on the content management side and the engineering side on the back end of it, is this something that you went to school for, or is this something that you learned throughout your career? Um,
Yeah, sure. So it was more throughout my career. So I started as an HTML editor after school, which was part journalism and part writing HTML code. So it was a small sports and statistics company. But of course, we had news stories that went along with the statistics packages. And so I was a final copy editor, picking headlines and or picking photos, writing headlines, getting all the code up. So we didn't have a CMS at the time. And then from there, I can remember some of the early people I worked with went more on the journalism track. And I started to really get into tech more heavily than I thought I would in the beginning. So from there, just starting to learn how to develop and even building a CMS there and just off to the races. I went off to the tech track from there.
that's an awesome story because I have a football background, so to go from sports editing journalism into technology, myself going from football into sales and marketing,
Yeah,
that's an easier transition as opposed to journalism going to technology.
yeah.
What were some of the things that brought you to that? You mentioned that you didn't have HTML people, so it just sparked your interest. What was that influx point where you just said, "Hey, okay, I'm going to go away from journalism into technology"?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say that as other competitor sites, I mean, we were the smallest, but if you can imagine, like ESPN.com at the point was like the master. They had every cool widget, all those things. And I remember having discussions with how can we monetize more things on the sites. And there was an idea that ESPN had like a TV like ticker at the bottom. And they were saying like we have all of our own data. Can we do something like that? And of course, it was 22 or something at the time. Like I can do that. I had no idea how to do something like that. So the more I dug into it, it was a flash thing that ran in a frame at the bottom. Like, okay. One of the guys on the team did more animation in Flash for, random like headers and things like that we'd have, on the site. But I remember having this book, which I can't remember what it was, but it was like a PHP and XML book. And it was the first time that I actually understood how to connect data via a database to a website and then pump that stuff into Flash, which it could do all this cool stuff. But that was like my real like programming project. And I really couldn't stop. It was like nights, weekends until I figured out how to get this thing to say hello, right? Through all the different I knew nothing about databases or even, I mean, barely understood how the servers worked, but that was how. And I realized that I really enjoyed every minute of that. So it was really starting to then focus on the tech pieces and design too, because even at the time,
Mhm.
I mean, it was like the webmaster, right? So I was starting to really learn even front end design and like getting books around how to make things look good and all those things. So I really just started to gravitate towards that track.
So was it more self-taught, or was this something that you actually decided to go back to school with,
That was
and
all
learn?
self-taught,
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Much like a lot of us at that time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, it always been the HTML process. What has your journey, starting from going in the back end, doing paperwork and stuff from journalism and so forth? How has that evolved for you? Like, what are some of the tools that you used, and the evolution of you going from PHP to where you are today?
Yeah. So I would say it was a very organic, if we can use that term, transition from starting from what everything that we see and then trying to figure out how does all that stuff get there. So I would say that really learning PHP, MySQL, and building these really small projects to replace the need for manual HTML editing. So after the sports job, I was actually at the National Audubon Society, and they had an initial CMS at that time that was, it would take Word docs that you would commit into a repository, and through the whatever the themes were, whatever templates were, whatever they were, it would build out the web pages and spit them out, which, if you can imagine, I don't know how those guys built that thing, but I mean, there were problems all the time. It didn't necessarily mean the tool was bad, but you really had to be highly trained to get this thing to look right. So myself and another, friend of mine, Aaron, who started at the same time, we're still friends today. We really were tasked with starting to get us more dynamic and more of our own homegrown. I mean, CMSs wasn't even really a term at that
Yeah.
point. It was, but it wasn't really like that wasn't the ask. So we started building these little tools, little pieces, sections of the site, things like the list of all the chapters. It was
Mhm.
emailed to somebody who would then put it into something and then email it to us, and we'd have to go into the HTML, like that kind of thing. So we started replacing manual processes that had multiple steps in like a workflow, for lack of a better term, and started to build those out. But then the big inflection point was when we transitioned the whole site to Drupal. And that was like the
Mm.
first time. It was a huge undertaking, and we really had to get our heads wrapped around the whole space. But that's how I would say, really crossed into like real engineering.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, obviously you're talking about 20 years ago into coming into now. I mean, obviously, there's plenty of CMS platforms out there today, and now the ones that are leading, I think I just read about Adobe, their AI, and how they are just jumped 15% today, based through their AI. Now, knowing that that's the journey that we are to today, is that something that you're touching, or you foresee that your industry will continue to do the AI? I know every industry is going to do some type of AI for a certain point. Yeah, discuss about that.
Sure. So certainly. So we're in digital publishing. So there is a lot of news around AI. For one, what happens to the content that's getting consumed? So I think we have, how do we curate it? How are we writing it? Is there a way to help there? And then on the, I guess, the front end side, or the thing that's, presented to the public, how are we making sure that our users are fully engaged with our domains? So that way the LLMs, all the GPTs, or even Google's AI search isn't just consuming the content and spitting it out, and people will never get to our site. So there are multiple challenges there that we need to solve. So we want to stay competitive in curating content. So I imagine we'll have different types of tools for our own editors to say crawl through our own autos data, for instance, like trying to help editors get to the article that they want to curate, and with all the different specs. Like, I'm going to make something up, best cars for dogs. What would that actually mean? There's dimensions of the car, all these different things that are fixed data that we have, but maybe these, AI LLM type things can really help give us more insights on the kinds of articles that the guys can write. So I think that's part of it. And then the other side of it is making sure that there are tools built into the front end that actually engage with our users and make them want to be on our sites longer. And I think that is it's wide open at this point.
Yeah, I foresee a lot of changes with AI and the rapidity of this. The whole AI boom is just there right now. If we were to switch gears and talk about, you mentioned that you were in journalism before. If you weren't in tech, is that what you would be doing today, or what is it that would be your passion to do?
I think it would be probably I would have landed in carpentry or something like that. Yeah. So my dad was a carpenter. I mean, he had a long career then in business, but I had the long lines of his grandfather and grandfather before that. They were all carpenters, and I still do carpentry on my own. I build things on my own. I kind of think that would have been my space. I
With
would have gone
carpentry.
that route. Yeah, I think so.
I mean, God bless you. Those are something that working with your hands daily. Like I remember doing it in high school, and
Yeah.
yeah, I learned. I was like, okay, I couldn't do this with my back and everything else. So
Yeah, that's certainly a concern. Hopefully by now I would have been done, you know.
yeah, exactly. Well, if we're talking about your father, is that one of your personal mentors, and is having a mentor something that is important to you?
Yeah, for sure. So my dad is a jack of all trades type person. And he's had his own businesses. He still has his own cigar shop, so he's still doing the thing. But certainly as a model for you can get into any area that you're interested in was always a good model that he presented. And like a funny story just about him doing work around the house. When I got to college, and we were off campus for the first time. I don't know, we must have been 19 or something. It was maybe junior year. And I remember one of the guys, their door was broken. I don't know whether the hinge was messed up. I can't remember. But I remember one of the guys pulled out a phone book and was looking for a handyman. And I thought, you can call a handyman? Like, I didn't even realize that was a thing because my dad just fixed everything. So I just like got tools and I was like, let's just fix it. So anyway, it's stuff like that. And I think that applies to even whether it's entrepreneurship or just getting into the different careers and just saying like, okay, I understand I don't know everything now, but let's just start the journey and see what happens. And that's the model my dad said, you know.
That's pretty important. I think just doing. I learn from failure. Some people learn differently, but I think just doing and just that 1% better each day is something that I live my life by. And if you're doing that, you're always going to get better. You're not gonna be at that 100% in one day. That's 100 days later. So it's that compound effects of just 1% a day.
Yeah.
Um, Now, besides your father, do you have any other influential people in your life that helps you through the tech space?
Through the tech space specifically, I would say that doing this for as long as I have a handful of really close friends that are in the space. We're still on Slack, even we're at different jobs now. And it's usually a constant pinging each other of what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Or obviously sending us news stories. So I think as far as tech goes, it's with my peers. I mean, certainly learning from the younger people on the team now, but it's really keeping up with all my old buddies is probably the biggest resource I have for like, oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, that's important to know that as you continue to go on, don't forget those people that help you get there, and then leverage them as you can. I mean, mentorship to me is pretty important. Now, on the flip side, what's one of your biggest failures, both either in the tech field or in your personal life?
Yeah, it's a good question in thinking about this because the failures, if we talk about projects, it's in the eye of or the perspective of the different stakeholders. So it's really hard for me to think about any one specific failure because I think even ones that I would consider everyone was overworked, it was disorganized, we couldn't get things done on time. The stakeholder at the end was happy. And there were also other projects where kind of the reverse had happened. We built exactly what we said we would, what we all agreed to, and yet the stakeholder wasn't happy for whatever reason. So I would probably consider it a failure at that point. But I would say that the biggest failures that I've ever been a part of were when the teams at play did not all have input into what was getting built, did not have a chance to all agree on specific timelines. And it was more like we talk about waterfall and agile, more like a management team would say, here, build this, and you have 3 months. And it just you fight to try to get through it. I think those disorganized projects were the ones that were the most that I always think about when new ones start to say, let's not repeat this and make sure that everyone has buy-in.
Now, elaborate on that, because in business and technology, most of those don't communicate. Usually it's the business leaders telling the tech team to do something, and the tech team will go ahead and say, yeah, we could do that, but knowing in the back end that it's going to be a disaster.
Yeah.
That complete buy-in in that life cycle of business and technology, how important is that?
It's vital. So I also think that it's very important for the business stakeholders to also be communicating context along the way of why things are being organized as a project. We need to increase revenue in this area by 20%, whatever that is. So the team understands the why, so they can get some perspective on, okay, I understand we're only going to have 3 months. This is why we only have 3 months. It may be a little easier to even to think about. Imagine you're building a project for the Oscars or the Daytona 500. Like those have fixed dates. Like that's an example. It's a very easy one to digest, right? But it's an example of why this is the deadline, or why we need to shift focus and move our resources into a specific area. So I think that needs to happen very, very consistently, if not monthly, quarterly, making sure the team is under full understanding of what the revenue looks like, what the objectives are, what your key results are for the year. So that helps. So when the project comes up the pike, they're already mentally prepared for the understanding of why. So I think that's a huge part of it. And I also think that it's important for the engineering side to not be put in a position of yes or no. It's how much and how long, right? And then that is a point of negotiation for the business and the tech team to actually create a real collaboration to say, okay, we have a fixed deadline. We have these features. What can we do by this time? As opposed to, well, we just have to work nights and weekends to get it done. That's, to me, not an acceptable answer. So I think that the more the teams are talking and used to communicating, you can come to those agreements and things will move along and minimize. Really, the goal is to minimize delays, is the way I look at it.
Now, in your career, has that always been the case of where like you get the buy-in from the business side and the technology side, or is that something that's more new, or you just adapt into your management style?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes, yes, and I've worked certainly in-house at companies that do that well. I was a consultant for many years. Some projects are very collaborative before even the project starts. Others were not. Those are the tough ones, right? Trying to get everyone on board and get things done quickly and all those things. And I would say now where I am at Hearst, it's done very well. We can see the results because the teams can be pretty quick. They're clear what they're all working on. And so as of this point, it's really a good model for what I've seen from other places where I've been.
Well, as we wrap up, one of the questions I like to ask is, what are some of the books that you would suggest reading, both on the technical side or as somebody's getting into the tech field, but also a mindset type book? Do you have any three that you like? These are my go-to.
Yeah, for sure. So the first one that I really started to think outside of just tech and that the job, oh, it's part of a business, right? And it's not just we get to play around like in a lab all day long. The Innovator's Dilemma is a really good one. And that was the first time, and for anyone that hasn't read it, it talks about how do companies that have a new idea, how do they figure out if it's time for them to get into the market or not? And I think it's been a long time since I read it, but I think one of the examples was like IBM not getting into the laptop market because it was too small. And the criticism was, how could you guys not be in this? And it was like, for them to get into that market, it just doesn't pay. They wait for it to get big they prepare, and then they get into it at that point. So it just got me thinking of, just because we've got a good tech idea, is it business? Is it a viable business? So I think along those lines, I would say piggybacking off of that, it's not a book per se, but I remember following a podcast of lectures from Carnegie Mellon in their MBA program. It was like business and entrepreneurship. I tried to find it when I was thinking about this, but I couldn't. But I suggest being able to really read and understand a profit and loss statement, even as an engineer. It's not that complicated. It's pretty straightforward. And just thinking in terms of, we've got a project, if it's going to cost $50,000 a year to run it, and you think you can only generate $20,000, that's not going to work, right? So I think at a very basic level, of engineers have an understanding of that. It really helps them to think about the technology solutions that they can provide. So even though the podcast is not a book, I would suggest that, or go to any university and see what their programs have and try to find their lectures or talks like that. And I would say for learning tech, certainly the O'Reilly publisher, like there, a lot of those books I've read over the years. I can't give you one specific, but something new on a platform like Udemy, Stephen Grider is a really good technical resource for anything new that's coming out. So I would say to anyone trying to learn a new skill, he's got a lot of really good courses that kind of fits the way that I learn.
Well, those are some really important books. I think that when you talked about understanding the business side of it from the technical side, and also understanding the P&L, those hiccups start, and that will help you not have some of those bigger hiccups down the road where you waste 6 months into development and say, okay, we got to scratch that. But I think those are some really bright things to talk about there. And before we go today, what's one question that you wish I would have asked during this podcast?
Oh, well, that's a tough one. That's like the end of an interview. I should have been prepared for. I would say, what's a good way when you've got a new project starting up? How do you figure out the right way to communicate to your team, not only the business context, but being specific around communicating the requirements? Like, how specific do you really need to get? Do I need a front-end form for this? Or do I need every single field, every single piece of validation? Like, how deep into the requirements you need to go would be a good question. And I would also, if I were to answer my own question, I would say that it depends on the team, right? If you're working on a platform and a team that's been around for 5 years, some of these things are inherent to the features that are being requested. Like, everyone's going to know. But if you're with a newer team, or even if you're on a contract squad, and you've got new members each time, you have to be super specific. The more specific you can get, the better. And then as a follow-up to that, trying to write specific requirements requires the time and space to do it. And for some projects that I've been on, we talked about failures before. It's generally when the management piece is not really accounted for. It's just assumed it could be done on the side, but it's not. It needs to be like still more than 50% of the time needs to be allocated for a person to actually have the time and space to do those things, and not just be double dipping engineering and management at the same time.
That's a great question and a perfect answer. And with that, Mike, I really appreciate you joining today on All Things Business and Technology. And I look forward to seeing your continued journey and having you come on as we get deeper into this podcast.
This is great, David. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. You have a good one.
You too.
Cheers. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you'll tune in next time. For more information on how we can help your business, check out our website at sigmaways.com. I'd love to hear your feedback. Please send me a message with any topic or questions you want me to cover. Also, if you're in the world of business and technology, I would love to have you as a guest. Please hit the like and subscribe button below and stay up to date on the next video. Once again, I'm David, and this is All Things Business and Technology. Cheers.